Why so many parents regret giving their house to their children. Robert Hensley signed the deed to his house over to his son on a Thursday morning in March in a small notary office that smelled like burnt coffee in less than 20 minutes. He drove home afterward feeling lighter than he had in months, certain he had just done the most responsible thing a father could do. 14 months later, he sat at his own kitchen table, reading a letter from a lawyer he had never met, a letter that mentioned his house by name as an asset that might need to be considered. This is his story. Robert had lived in the same house in a small Pennsylvania town for 38 years. He and his wife, Carol, bought it the year before their son Mark was born, a modest 3-bedroom colonial with a detached garage Robert had built with his own hands one summer, board by board, teaching himself as he went. He raised both his children there, Mark and his younger sister Susan, worked for 31 years managing the local hardware store downtown, the kind of job where everyone in town knew his name and he knew most of theirs back. Carol passed away 2 years ago. Quietly, after a long illness Robert had nursed her through in the same bedroom where they'd slept together for nearly 4 decades. Since then, Robert had lived alone in that house, managing well enough, keeping busy with a small garden and a standing Tuesday breakfast with a few old friends from the hardware store. He wasn't lonely exactly, but he had started thinking more and more about what would happen to everything he'd built once he was gone. The house, the modest savings, the small life insurance policy Carol had insisted they keep up all those years ago. He had watched over the years several friends and neighbors go through the slow, exhausting process of settling a parent's estate after death. The paperwork, the court dates, the months of waiting for a house to legally clear probate before anyone could so much as sell it or move in. He remembered, in particular, a co-worker from the hardware store spending the better part of a year untangling his own late mother's modest estate, a process that seemed, from the outside, needlessly bureaucratic and expensive for something that should have been simple. Robert did not want that for Mark and Susan. He wanted, whatever else happened, for his children to be spared that particular kind of grief-soaked paperwork. That thinking sharpened considerably after a routine checkup in January. His doctor, reviewing an EKG that had come back with an irregular pattern, sat him down and explained, gently but clearly, that Robert had a heart condition, treatable, manageable with medication, not an emergency, but not nothing either. Robert drove home that afternoon rattled in a way he hadn't expected to be, turning over, for the first time in his life with any real urgency, the question of what would happen to his children if something happened to him without warning. He didn't want them dealing with lawyers. He didn't want them paying estate taxes, standing in courthouse lines, waiting months for probate to clear before they could even access what he had spent a lifetime building. He wanted to make it simple for them. He wanted, more than anything, to give them something clean and uncomplicated, a final act of care from a father who had spent his whole life taking care of people. It was his neighbor, George, 74, who planted the specific idea in his head over coffee one Saturday morning. "I did the same thing 2 years ago," George told him, stirring sugar into his cup. "Signed the house straight over to my daughter. No fuss, no lawyer fees, no probate for her to deal with when I'm gone. Went down to the county office, filled out a quitclaim deed, done in an afternoon. Best decision I ever made, Bob. Wish I'd done it sooner." Robert listened, and something in him relaxed. If George had done it, and it had gone smoothly, then surely it wasn't the complicated, expensive process he'd been dreading. Surely a father didn't need to spend hundreds of dollars on an estate attorney just to give his own son something that was going to belong to him eventually anyway. He decided within the week that he would transfer the house to Mark, his older child, 44, married, living just 20 minutes away. It felt, in that moment, like the obvious choice. Mark was local. Mark could keep an eye on the house and on Robert more easily than Susan could from 3 states away. It wasn't a decision made to favor one child over another. Not in Robert's mind. It was simply practical. He never discussed it with Susan at all. It didn't occur to him that he needed to. The transfer itself took less time than Robert expected. He drove to the county recorder's office one Thursday morning with a quitclaim deed he'd downloaded from a website and filled out himself, following a template he found with a simple search. A notary stamped it, a clerk filed it, 20 minutes, start to finish, and the house Robert had lived in for 38 years now legally belonged to his son. He called Mark that afternoon to tell him. "Dad, are you sure?" Mark asked, and Robert could hear real hesitation in his son's voice, the kind of hesitation that, looking back later, Robert wished he had paid closer attention to. "I'm sure," Robert said. "I want to make this easy for you and your sister when the time comes. No lawyers, no headaches, just yours, free and clear." "What about Susan?" Mark asked quietly. "I'll figure out something fair for her separately," Robert said, though even as the words left his mouth, he hadn't actually figured out what that would look like. He hung up the phone that day feeling, for the first time in months, like he had finally taken control of something, like he had done right by his children. He did not yet understand how much he had actually given away, or how little control he had left over the very roof over his own head. The first few weeks after the transfer felt entirely ordinary. Robert continued living in the house exactly as he always had, tending his garden, hosting his Tuesday breakfasts, sleeping in the same bedroom he'd shared with Carol for decades. Nothing about his daily life seemed to have changed at all. It was Mark's wife, Diane, 39, practical and increasingly anxious about the family's own finances, who first began speaking about the house differently. It started small, the way these things usually do. "We're going to need to redo that roof soon," Diane mentioned one Sunday during a family dinner at Robert's house, a phrase that 6 months earlier would have simply been a comment about maintenance, but now carried a subtle new weight, an unspoken "our roof" underneath the words. Mark, for his part, hadn't wanted the house transferred quite so soon or quite so quickly. He loved his father and understood on some level that this was Robert's way of expressing care. But Mark was also quietly in a difficult financial position he hadn't fully shared with his father. A small contracting business he'd started 3 years earlier had failed the previous winter, leaving him with debts he was still working through, debts Diane worried about constantly, debts that made the sudden appearance of an unencumbered house feel, to her, like a genuine lifeline rather than simply Robert's home. Diane had grown up watching her own parents struggle financially, and that history had shaped her into a woman who thought about money constantly, carefully, sometimes anxiously, a trait that had served the young family well during ordinary times, but which now, in the wake of Mark's failed business, had sharpened into something closer to quiet desperation. She did not see herself as taking anything from Robert. In her mind, the house had simply become part of the family's financial safety net, exactly as Robert himself had intended when he signed it over, and it seemed only reasonable to her that the family should begin treating it accordingly. "You know," Diane said one evening, not unkindly, while clearing the dinner table, "since the house is technically ours now, it might make sense for you to contribute something toward the property, taxes, and insurance. Just a small monthly amount. It would help us out quite a bit." Robert sat with that request for a long moment, something uncomfortable settling in his chest that he couldn't quite name yet. He had lived in this house for 38 years. He had built the garage with his own two hands, and now, technically, legally, he was being asked to pay rent in his own kitchen to his own son's wife. He agreed to contribute because it seemed like the reasonable thing to do, and because arguing about it felt somehow beneath the dignity of the gift he had intended to give. But he began noticing more and more how often decisions about the house, repairs, landscaping, even which contractor to hire for the roof Diane had mentioned, were being made without him being consulted at all. He was still living there. He was no longer, in any meaningful sense, the one who decided what happened to the place. 3 months after the transfer, Robert received a phone call that changed everything. It came from an attorney's office, polite and formal, explaining that they represented a creditor pursuing outstanding debts from Mark's failed contracting business. The attorney explained carefully that they were conducting an asset review related to the debt, and that a property recently transferred into Mark's name, the house at Robert's address, had come up as a relevant asset in that review. Robert sat frozen at his kitchen table, phone pressed to his ear, feeling something cold spread through his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. "That's my house," he said, more sharply than he meant to. "I've lived here for 38 years. "I understand, sir," the attorney said, not unkindly, "but legally, the property is currently titled in your son's name. That does make it potentially relevant to this matter. I'd recommend you speak with your own attorney about your options." Robert hung up the phone and sat in his kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing, replaying George's confident voice from that Saturday morning coffee. "Best decision I ever made, Bob," and wondering for the first time whether George had actually understood what he'd done either, or whether he had simply gotten lucky so far. Around this same time, the fracture with Susan, which had been quietly forming since the day of the transfer, finally broke open completely. Susan had learned about the house, not from Robert, but from a cousin, mentioned casually during a family phone call, the way important secrets often surface sideways through someone who didn't realize they were revealing anything at all. "Dad gave the house to Mark," the cousin said. "Didn't you know?" Susan called her father that night, her voice tight with a hurt Robert hadn't fully anticipated. "You gave the house to Mark," she said, not quite a question. "And you didn't think to mention it to me, not even a phone call." "Susan, it's not like that," Robert said, though even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure what it was like. "I was going to work something out for you separately, something fair." "When, Dad? After you'd already given away the only real thing you had to give?" The conversation ended badly, and the ones that followed over the next several months weren't much better. Susan grew distant, her calls less frequent, shorter, colder. She didn't visit that Thanksgiving, the first Thanksgiving in Robert's entire adult life, that one of his children had chosen to stay away. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday in February, almost a year to the day since Robert had first sat in his doctor's office and heard the words irregular heart rhythm. It was formal, precise, and unmistakably serious. A notice from the creditor's attorney indicating that the house, as an asset titled in Mark's name, was being formally evaluated as part of a potential settlement related to Mark's business debts. Robert read the letter 3 times, sitting alone at the kitchen table where he had eaten breakfast every morning for 38 years in a house that, on paper, was no longer his at all. That same week, in a tense phone call, Susan said something that Robert would carry with him for the rest of his life. "You decided the house was Mark's," she said, her voice flat, exhausted rather than angry now. "So maybe you should decide to live with Mark too." Robert sat with that sentence long after the call ended, feeling something break open inside him that had nothing to do with his heart condition and everything to do with the slow, sinking realization of exactly what he had done in trying to make things simple for his children. In trying to avoid lawyers and probate and complication, he had instead created every complication he had been trying to avoid. His own housing security now legally tangled up in his son's business debts. His relationship with his daughter fractured over a decision she'd never even been part of. He had meant it as love. He understood now, with painful clarity, that meaning well and acting wisely were not always the same thing. The next morning, Robert did something he should have done 14 months earlier. He called an attorney, not a general practice lawyer, not someone recommended casually over coffee, but a specialist in elder law and estate planning, found through a referral from his doctor's office. He sat across from her desk 2 days later and told her everything, from the EKG that started it all, to George's confident advice, to the quitclaim deed he'd filled out himself, to the letter now sitting on his kitchen table. The news was not simple, and the attorney did not pretend otherwise. Because the house was now legally titled in Mark's name, it genuinely could be considered, at least potentially, in resolving Mark's business debts, depending on how the creditor's claim ultimately proceeded. Undoing the transfer completely wasn't straightforward either. Reversing a deed can raise its own tax and legal complications, and simply asking Mark to sign it back over wasn't a guaranteed fix. But the attorney also gave Robert something he badly needed in that moment, a clear, actionable path forward rather than simple despair. She explained that Robert and Mark could formalize what's known as a life estate, a legal document properly drafted and recorded that would guarantee Robert's right to live in the house for the remainder of his life, regardless of what happened with the title itself, regardless of any future creditor claims against Mark specifically. It wouldn't undo everything, but it would protect the one thing Robert cared about most urgently, his own home, his own roof, for as long as he needed it. She also raised something Robert hadn't fully considered. It might be possible, depending on the specifics of the creditor's claim and applicable state law, to argue that Robert retained an equitable interest in the property, given how recently and informally the transfer had occurred, strengthening his position considerably. It would require real legal work. It would not be quick or entirely free, but it was possible. The attorney also explained something that struck Robert harder than almost anything else she said that afternoon, that his situation, while stressful, was in many ways less severe than what she'd seen happen to other families in similar circumstances. She described, without naming names, a case where a father had transferred his home to a son who later went through a difficult divorce, and the house had become entangled in the divorce settlement itself, ultimately forcing a sale neither the father nor the son had ever wanted. She described another case where an elderly mother, having transferred her home to a daughter, found herself effectively powerless when that daughter later decided, for entirely unrelated reasons, that she wanted her mother to move into a smaller apartment instead. Robert's situation, painful as it was, still had a workable path forward. Not every family was so fortunate. Robert left that office with a plan for the first time in over a year. Not a perfect solution, but a real one, built by someone who actually understood the terrain he'd wandered into so casually. He called Mark that same evening and asked him to come over alone, without Diane, for a conversation that needed to happen father to son, not father to household. Mark arrived looking tired, older somehow than Robert remembered him looking even a year ago, carrying the particular exhaustion of a man juggling debts he was ashamed of and a father he didn't know how to properly help. "Dad, I never wanted this to happen," Mark said, sitting at the same kitchen table where the creditor's letter still sat. "I should have said something when you first brought up transferring the house. I knew things were shaky with the business. I just didn't want to worry you." "I know," Robert said, "but we're past whose fault this is, son. I need us to fix it together the right way this time." They spent the next 2 months working through it properly, with the attorney's guidance every step of the way. Mark agreed, without hesitation, to sign the formal life estate document guaranteeing Robert's right to remain in the house, protected as much as legally possible from any future claims against Mark's separate financial troubles. They also began, for the first time, an honest conversation about the business debt itself. Mark finally telling his father the full truth about how bad things had actually gotten, and Robert, in turn, offering a modest loan from his savings, carefully documented this time with actual terms rather than another vague, well-meaning gesture with no protection built into it. The conversation with Susan was harder and slower, and Robert didn't rush it, understanding finally that she deserved more than a quick apology over the phone. He drove the 6 hours to see her in person, sat in her living room, and said the thing he should have said over a year earlier, before any deed had ever been signed. I made a decision that affected both of you, and I only talked to one of you about it, he said. That was wrong, Susan, not because I don't trust you or love you any less than your brother. I just wasn't thinking clearly, and I owe you an honest apology, not an excuse. Susan was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that carries real weight. I just wanted to be included, Dad, she finally said, not necessarily given the same thing, just included. Together, with the attorney's help, Robert restructured his entire estate plan from the ground up, not through hurried decisions made at a county notary office, but through careful, deliberate conversations that included both of his children equally this time. The house itself remained marks on paper, protected now by the life estate, ensuring Robert's lifelong right to live there. Susan received a clearly documented share of Robert's other assets, along with a designated portion of any future proceeds if the house were ever sold after Robert's passing. Nothing about the new arrangement was perfectly, mathematically equal. Families rarely are. But everything about it was transparent, and everyone involved had finally had a seat at the table. The relationship with Susan didn't heal overnight. There were still a few strained holidays, a few conversations that ran shorter than they used to. But she came for Christmas that year, for the first time in 2 years, and stood in the kitchen with her father making the same pie recipe her mother used to make. And Robert understood, watching her, that some things broken by carelessness can still be rebuilt by honesty, even if the rebuilding takes longer than anyone would like. He noticed that Christmas, small signs of the old ease returning between them, the way Susan teased him about oversalting the gravy, the way she lingered in the kitchen afterward instead of retreating to her old bedroom the moment dinner ended. It wasn't the same as before. Robert didn't expect it ever fully would be, but it was real, and it was theirs, and he understood now that it had been worth every uncomfortable mile of that 6-hour drive to go and ask for it properly, in person, rather than hoping time alone would quietly repair what silence had broken. Robert's story is a common one, more common than most people realize, precisely because it so rarely starts with anything resembling bad intentions. Nobody sets out to endanger their own home or fracture their family by trying to do something generous and simple for their children, but good intentions without proper guidance can create exactly the kind of complications they were meant to avoid. If you are thinking about transferring your house to your children while you're still alive, speak with an attorney who specializes in elder law and estate planning before you sign anything at all. Not a general notary, not a friend's confident recommendation, someone who actually understands the specific risks involved. Understand clearly the difference between probate, which many people fear more than they need to, and the actual legal alternatives available to you: trusts, life estates, transfer on death deeds, each with different protections and different risks. Remember that a house titled in your child's name becomes exposed to whatever happens in that child's life, their debts, their divorce, their own legal troubles, even if none of that seems remotely likely at the time you make the transfer. If you have more than one child, include all of them in these conversations, even if the final decision ends up being different for each of them. A decision made quietly, without everyone's knowledge, can fracture a family far more deeply than an uneven outcome ever would. Simplifying things for your children should never come at the cost of your own housing security. There is nothing generous about a gift that leaves you legally vulnerable in the very home you gave away. And know that safer alternatives almost always exist. A properly drafted trust, or a life estate, or a transfer on death deed can very often accomplish everything you were hoping to achieve. Avoiding probate, simplifying things for your children without ever putting your own security or your family's harmony at risk. Robert still lives in that house today, in the same bedroom he shared with Carol for nearly 4 decades, sleeping soundly for the first time in over a year, knowing that no matter what happens with Mark's business, no matter what the future holds, his right to remain there is finally properly protected, not by good intentions this time, but by a document that actually means something. Have you or your parents ever considered transferring a house before death? What would you want to know first before signing anything at all? Tell us in the comments below and let us know what city or country you're watching from tonight. Someone else, sitting at their own kitchen table, considering exactly what Robert once considered, might need to read your answer before they make a decision they can't easily undo. If Robert's story meant something to you, subscribe to Better with Time for more stories from the Dignity years. Because protecting the people you love should never require giving up the ground beneath your own feet.